Thank you for tuning in. We realize you're probably getting way more screen time in than you want right now, but we're trying to bring you screen time that is fun and will give you some inspiration for when you go for those little walks or for down the line when you are able to travel and explore again the way that we are used to. Just a couple of quick notes about Glazers and then we'll kick into this. Just an FYI, by default, we've set everybody's cameras to be off and your mics to be off. There is an opportunity for you to ask questions, so don't be shy. If you have a question, please feel free to ask. You can ask that in the chat room, or you can ask with your voice if you want to. You'll just have to unmute your mic to do that. We are recording these sessions. The goal there is to make them available online. So we're working on some quick edits and then probably putting them up on a Vimeo channel in the next few days, hopefully by the end of this week. So there's that. So you'll be able to see it again down the line. The other thing I want to share is that Glazers is open right now. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 for curbside pickup. That means you can place an order online. We'll have it ready to go and we'll bring it out to your car for you. You can also place web orders 24/7. We are doing free shipping on orders over $50. There are some restrictions to that, but just so you know, we're here for you. We have products available and just we're here for you. I also want to mention that in conjunction with what we're doing today with Sigma, there's a special offer that has been put together. So I'm going to share that. We're letting more people in. Hang on. But Sigma is donating 5% of all Sigma lens sales through Glazer's camera through the end of June to the Seattle Foundation towards the COVID-19 Response Fund. So if you've been eyeing a Sigma lens, this is a great opportunity to go ahead and get that lens if you're able. And then a portion of those sales are going to the Seattle Foundation in support of their COVID-19 Response Fund. So anyhow, with that said, I'm going to hand this off to Aaron. Aaron works with Sigma. If you've been to our events here in the store, Aaron has been here multiple times over the past couple of years. He comes for PhotoFest. He and I partnered up on some photo walks where we go out and do urban landscapes and things like that. So you probably will recognize his face. So Aaron, I'm going to let you lead the conversation from here. Again, if you have questions, don't be shy. Please feel free to ask those questions in the chat room or through your voice with the camera. Totally up to you. You have options. So Aaron, go ahead and take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. Well, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, taking time to hang out with us. And I want to thank Glazers again for putting this on and allowing us a little bit of an opportunity to get together while we're all isolated at home. So we're going to be talking a little bit about landscape today. And I thought that I would start out by introducing you to some of Sigma's lenses that I recommend for people endeavoring to go out and shoot landscapes, and then transition into some of the lenses that I use myself, because they're a little bit different. And then from there, I was hoping we could open it up and field questions and get a conversation going based off of what you guys are interested in seeing and hearing. So with that, we'll jump in real quick. Get this going. All right, so hopefully that's showing. So out of our lineup, the lenses that I generally recommend for people who are getting started in this would be zoom lenses. And I'd recommend pairing something like the 14 to 24 or potentially the 12 to 24 if you want a little bit more on the wide angle side with a lens like the 24 to 105. And the reason I recommend starting there is that gives you a lot of coverage. You get ultra wide fields of view when you're trying to get that really big vista. If you're in a really scenic area, you want to get as much of the environment in front of you into your frame as possible. Those wide angle focal lengths are also really helpful. They have a short focusing distance. So when you're shooting in tighter proximity, like if you're walking through the forest, you've got objects, trees, rocks all around you. Those wider focal lengths will be able to get more of that scene in your frame and be able to focus in closer proximity as well. And then a lens like the 24 to 105 gives you more normal perspectives. So if you want to compress distance and you can't, say, walk across this field with that wide angle lens, because wide angle lenses will tend to make distant objects look progressively smaller and smaller the further away they are from the camera. So having something with a little bit more reach to it can also be really helpful where you can't get closer to your subject, or you want to isolate just one aspect of that scene in front of you rather than showing the entire scene. And the combination of those two lenses gives you a huge range of scenes that you're going to be able to photograph without adding a ton of extra weight to your bag. The 12 to 24 and the 24 to 105 are both f4. And if you're shooting landscape, often people are going to be shooting at smaller apertures to get as much depth of field as possible. So having a lens that's not blazing speed like a 2.8 or faster usually is not going to be a detriment to this work, especially if you're working on a tripod. Even if you're working towards dusk or daylight or in low light situations, often you can use a slower shutter speed to overcome some of the technical difficulties you may otherwise have with a slower aperture lens. The 14 to 24, the earlier shots on here, is a 2.8, so that gives you a nice balance between range and speed. Now, while that is what I recommend people to start with, that's not often what I end up using myself. So we'll jump in on, let's see, this group here. So when I go out shooting myself, I tend to take, let's see. Here we go. I tend to shoot primarily with fixed focal length lenses or primes. And these are certainly less versatile. I can't cover quite as much ground with these as if I want to change the perspective or the look of my image, I have to move in that scene, and sometimes that's not going to be possible. But the reason I tend to use these lenses more, having a fixed focal length really helps me to see or pre-visualize my scene with that perspective in mind. And I find that I can get through identifying something that I like in a scene and photographing it in the way that I was intending to much more quickly with a fixed focal length than I can with a zoom lens. The fixed focal length lenses also tend to be smaller and lighter. So if you're going on longer hikes or treks, especially getting away from your car, that can be a real benefit. And then a lot of my work, even in landscape as well, I'm often not shooting for maximum depth of field. I don't always want to have everything from near to far in tack sharp focus. Often I'll want to have just a sliver of that scene in focus to try to direct my viewer's eye. And having a faster aperture lens, the 28 and the 40 millimeter, where these samples were taken from, those are both 1.4 apertures. So that allows me to be a lot more selective about what part of my scene is in focus. And especially if you get into sunrise, sunset, or venturing into like night sky photography, having a faster aperture lens can be a huge benefit there too.
And I have a couple of those night sky shots from our trek last year handy if anybody wants to see those. I just pulled them off actually.
Yeah, that was a pretty fun event. That was probably one of the most ambitious events that I've done in recent history. We went out to a fire lookout station at around Mount Rainier. So it was probably around 2 hours from downtown Seattle. And then it was from the point that we parked, it was maybe a 20-minute walk up from there. So it wasn't too crazy, but the view of Mount Rainier was pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
And so those are all four of those are also art series lenses. So within our lineup of lenses, that means that these lenses were designed to give you the best possible optical performance, which means they're removing optical distortion, which especially on the wider focal lengths is something you have to be wary of, or it can make your photos look unnatural. We're also working to remove chromatic aberration and vignetting, so you have better color accuracy, especially as you're closer to your maximum aperture. So if you're shooting for more shallow depth of field, that can be really beneficial there too. Want to open it up to some questions?
Yeah, does anybody have any questions so far about the images that he's shared or landscape photography in general? Please feel free to ask. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. You guys are so quiet. This is so quiet. So Aaron, most of your shots are handheld, or are you using a tripod?
I almost always use a tripod. I'll typically, so when I'm out hiking and not just scouting from a car, I usually have one of the Peak Design clips on one of my backpack straps. So I have a camera out and ready. Or I use the mind shift rotation packs pretty often too, so I can get a camera in and out of a bag pretty quickly. So I'll have one lens, usually something lighter and wider. And as I see something in the scene in front of me that kind of catches my eye, I'll try a couple shots before I put down the tripod to figure out where my best vantage point is. But when I go to the point of setting up the final shot, it's almost always going to be on a tripod. Even if I am shooting at more moderate apertures like f4 or f5.6, I want to have the ISO as low as possible so I get the cleanest possible image.
Okay, so I do have some questions coming in from the chat room, so I'm going to start firing these off. So were the images that you shared so far, were those shot on a full frame camera or a crop sensor camera?
All of the photos, with one exception, were shot on full frame, a combination of 5D Mark III, an A7 II, an A7R III, and the Sigma FP. One of them was shot on a 7D Mark II. Generally speaking, when I'm going out shooting landscape, I want to take the larger sensor cameras because I have more options for higher quality wide angle lenses on full frame cameras than I do with crop sensor cameras. And that's not universally true. It just happens to be the case with the equipment that I have access to. I don't have as many crop sensor specific lenses at my disposal.
Okay. How many lenses are you typically carrying in the field?
I try not to go out with more than two, just because, well, I guess it depends. If I'm going out hiking or backpacking, I try to keep it to one or two just because I have other equipment that's going to be with me between the tripod and just hiking and survival gear. If I'm going from spot to spot in my car, I'll take more lenses. But even then, I try not to take more than 3 or 4 when I'm going out on longer, like car-based excursions. Because I find too much choice can often get in the way of trying to visualize that scene most effectively. If I'm worried about, should I shoot it with this lens or that lens or a third lens, I'm not spending as much time as I could be really analyzing the scene in front of me and making sure that I'm capturing whatever aspect of it caught my eye in the first place. That's another kind of reason I like to shoot with primes, generally speaking, over zooms. Removing one of those variables that could potentially take my attention away from the scene in front of me, I find it just helps to keep me focused and get me to the end result more quickly.
Agreed. I personally have only primes in my kits. There are occasions where I'll rent a zoom lens for different projects. But I love the prime because it does force me to kind of like move around in different ways and try and look at things a little bit differently. But I too tend to carry 1 or 2 lenses depending on the project, just to kind of keep it a little bit lighter, less on your back, less to kind of haul, which is nice. And someone else is asking kind of as a follow-up to that, how do you keep yourself from changing lenses constantly?
Yeah.
Well, the way to do that is to carry less lenses.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big reason why I shoot with the primes as well. It helps to eliminate that distraction in a lot of cases.
And I mean, also another way to worry less about changing lenses is if you add zoom lenses into your kit, then you have the option of zooming in and out and that kind of thing. So you know, potentially could cover the range of a couple of primes or more, obviously, with a zoom. So that's one thing to consider is if you're kind of like, do I want zoom? Do I want prime? What do I want to do? One great way to do that is obviously renting or borrowing from your friends if they're willing to loan them to you. But just trying different things is always helpful. One quick question is DG, is that a crop sensor lens?
Oh yeah, the nomenclature. So DG denotes full frame coverage, DC denotes crop sensor, and then DN denotes a lens that was designed specifically for the shorter flange distance of a mirrorless camera. Okay,
so DG is a crop lens. What was the second one again?
DC.
DC, okay. So DG is for full frame, DC is for crop sensor.
Right.
And then let's see, what are some of your favorite places to take photos, Aaron?
So I generally go about location scouting one of 2 ways. I also do quite a bit of hiking personally. So whenever I'm out hiking, I definitely have at least one camera set up with me. And for those, I'm usually trying to find locations that are a little bit more off the beaten path. So the further it is from like a major highway, hopefully the less likely there's going to be, you know, a zoo of people there. I find that I really like shooting in areas that there's a lot of variation in terrain. So I don't go out shooting in, I don't know, like flat fields or meadows that often. I usually try to find something that I can get some elevation on, because I find that that gives me a lot of opportunities for interesting vantage points. And then the other route would be, often I'll just end up wandering out in my car with some equipment with me. And I take kind of a similar approach in those endeavors. I try to find less busy roads or back roads that I can just wander around. And I'll drive through an area that looks interesting or has interesting terrain, or usually I'm looking for less developed areas, more open spaces. So try to get out of the city and just wander around back roads and state highways and just see what catches my eye without setting much of an agenda.
And my approach is a little bit different. I'm just going to throw my 2 cents in here because I've done a fair bit of traveling. I have favorite places that I love to go back to, like the Highlands of Scotland or the Oregon coast. You know, I'll go to Cannon Beach, seaside area 3 to 5 times a year. There's just something about that space that like resonates. Like I spent Christmas there this past year because I wanted to just chill out and relax, and it's beautiful. So I'll ask your question in just a second, Jim, but that's like one approach. I'm also a fan of the road trip. And when I can, taking the smaller roads instead of the big expressways so that you can find interesting things along the way to photograph. So Jim, as asking a kind of a follow-up question is, how often do you go someplace new, or how often do you keep going back to the same favorite places? I know for me, like I said, I go to Cannon Beach several times a year. If I can. Obviously, I really haven't done that this year, so it does make me sad. For me, like going back to the Highlands of Scotland or Edinburgh in Scotland, like those are places I could go to again and again. Aaron, do you have places like that that you like, even though I know part of it for me is like, when I think about spending money on travel, there's a little guilt if I go to some place I've been to before, because I know that I should be going somewhere new. But do you like wrestle with that at all? Or are there places that you just connect with that like, yes, I have to go back there again?
I would say more broadly, there are places like that. I try not to frequent the same exact spots over and over again, unless it's for something specific. Like I found a really great location, but the light wasn't great that day, or I didn't have the right lens to get that scene. I'll try to leave myself notes so I can get back to it, and I'll go back and shoot it on a better day or with the right gear. But if I get photos that I'm happy with from that endeavor, I try not to retread ground whenever I can, because there's just so much terrain out there. I'd rather keep pushing on and try to find another scene that I hadn't come across, or another area. But I definitely do find that there are regions, or more general areas that I keep finding things that I like in that general direction, or that road found a lot of new vantage points, or that forest had a lot of interesting trails. So whenever I find those areas, I definitely try to be as systematic as I can about fully exploring that region, or that whatever that park is, or whatever that road, wherever that leads to. But I try not to reshoot things over and over again, unless it was because I didn't get it right the first time.
Right. There's some people that chase that one shot at that one time, and they want it to be just perfect. And you can't always do that unless you plan for it. And then there's this thing called weather that can sometimes get in the way, even when you plan. So there's a few more questions, so I'm going to get us on to some of these other questions. One question is, for crop sensor camera, would you recommend the 10 to 20 or the 16 1.4?
I would say it depends on what you're shooting. The 16 is one of those DN lenses. So that means that is designed specifically for the shorter flange distance of mirrorless cameras, and therefore will not work on an SLR like a Rebel or a Nikon 5000 or 3000 series camera. If you're shooting with Micro Four Thirds or a Sony, like a 5000 or 6000 series camera, or one of the Canon M crop sensor bodies, the 16 is a great lens. It gives you effectively a 24 to 32 millimeter field of view, depending on what size sensor you're using it on. And that's really right in my sweet spot of focal lengths that I find really versatile, really flexible. It's not very big, so it's easy to travel with. It's a great hiking companion because it doesn't take much weight. If you're shooting on an SLR with a crop sensor, the 10 to 20 would be a great bet.
Yeah, I actually had that at one point in time when I was using crop sensor DSLRs back in the day. So what lens do you most often wish you had but don't when you're out shooting? So is there one lens that's not in the kit that you wish you had in the kit? My guess is you're going to say, I have all the lenses. So,
One of the benefits of being a tech rep for a lens manufacturer, I do have pretty much every lens that we make, except for like the 3 to 800 and the 2 to 500. So that being said, I definitely don't take them all with me. I try to keep as little gear in my bag or in the car as I can, just because I don't like to expose myself to potentially losing something or spending more time looking at which lens I'm going to use than actually shooting. But I would say when I started shooting landscape, I would generally only go out with one lens, and it usually would be something between 24 and 28. And that covered a good portion of what I would encounter. Usually I'm going to be shooting wider than longer. But I found, especially as I started working with Sigma and using more lenses than what I traditionally had access to, and I started using more longer focal lengths, which I didn't historically do. I found that having something a little bit longer actually made for a really helpful companion to that wide angle lens. And so now I'll travel with something like 35, a 40, or a 50, or maybe like the 70 macro, in addition to my wide angle lens, so that I have something that can get me the wider vista. But then if I want to shoot a little tighter on something like a specific grove of trees or a rock formation, or if I want to do some macro, something that I found along the way, then I have something a little bit more flexible than just that wide angle lens, which is not going to get everything.
right. So one question is, how does the different seasons change? How do you prepare for them? So when you're going out for landscape photography, kind of what processes do you go through as you're preparing for different kinds of shooting scenarios or different seasons?
Yeah, definitely keep an eye on the forecast, especially if I know that I'm going out a couple days in advance. I'll watch the forecast and see how it changes over the couple days leading up to that actual outing. I always take layers, even in the middle of summer. You just never know, especially something I've learned a couple times. When you're dealing with elevation gains, while it might be, cool and totally fine in shorts at the trailhead, it could be a very different temperature. You can have completely different conditions by the time you get to where that trail terminates if you're gaining a lot of ground. So I'll usually keep in spring, basically all seasons, but middle of summer, I'll keep an insulating layer, something that has like compressible down or synthetic down. I try to stay with the synthetics or with wool, because if they get wet, they keep working. Try to stay away from cotton as much as possible, because when that gets wet, it will lose all of its insulation properties, and it can actually get you into trouble with hypothermia. So yeah, I'll always take an insulating layer. Almost always I'll carry like a rain shell too, a rain jacket, and depending on the season and the forecast, I may also take rain pants or like boot covers. If there's any chance that I might get wet while I'm out there, I'm going to have something with me to prevent that, because that can ruin a day pretty quickly.
Right.
And then just other supplies, like making sure you've got plenty of water, snacks, so that if you are burning more energy than what you thought going up, you're not going to crash on the way back down.
So we have a couple more questions. We have just a few more minutes. One person did ask to see the night sky stuff. So
sure.
I'll queue those up in a minute or so. I want to just get through a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So considering an image stabilizer in the lens, is it reasonable to think you could leave behind a tripod? I'm going to say yes, because I actually do a fair bit of landscape photography without a tripod. But I also think it's like, depending on what your goal is. If you're doing night sky stuff, you need a tripod.
Yeah.
But if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a bright sunny day, you may not need a tripod. Aaron, do you have any additional feedback on that?
You can absolutely shoot landscape without a tripod. I would say it does really depend on what kind of look you're going for, where you're thinking those images are going to end up, and your own threshold for noise and motion blur. So if you're shooting handheld, you're going to have a limit placed on what you're going to be able to shoot somewhere, either in ISO or in shutter speed. To keep your ISO as low as possible, you're going to start pushing into shutter speeds that could encounter motion blur, either from you holding the equipment, or if there's wind moving through the scene in front of you, you could catch motion blur there. If you're shooting water, that's an obvious source of motion blur. And to keep your shutter speeds fast enough to freeze that motion, which may otherwise cause images to not be as sharp as they could be, that means you're going to have to use higher ISO values. And while cameras have definitely improved by leaps and bounds in the last 5 to 8 years, and I can use much higher ISOs now than what I would have been comfortable with a couple of years ago. Knowing that I'm going to end up trying to do something with most of those photos at some point, whether it's prints or cropping in to get a specific view out of it, or even if it's just going to end up on the web. Not only do you get more noise at higher ISOs, you also tend to shrink your overall dynamic range. And that's one of the things that I often find myself struggling with, trying to get as much information in that scene captured between the brightest of the bright tones and the darkest of the dark tones. As you increase your ISO, your overall tonal range is going to decrease as well. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but that being said, I don't have a lightweight tripod. It's definitely a burden every time I take it, and it's something I probably should just get a better tripod for, but.
Well, and I'll interject super quick so we can get through these last couple of questions and unfortunately wrap things up soon is, think about, what the goals are for your photography. If you're going to photograph waterfall, no matter the time of day, you need a tripod for that, because typically when we photograph a waterfall, we want that longer shutter speed to get the cottony looking water. But you're asking again about image stabilization in the lenses. It can be helpful. It can help compensate a little bit. It just depends on how slow that shutter speed is getting. There is a point where the shutter speed will get too slow and the image stabilization can only do so much. So, think about your goals. I also will travel with a tripod, but I have a lighter weight. I know his tripod is heavy because we did an event last year and he had his tripod and I had my tripod. My tripod weighs about a third of what his but that's the other thing. There's lots of tripod options out there. So just think about what your goals are for your images. But for a lot of landscape photography, you can definitely go without a tripod. You can shoot a lot of things handheld. Just keep an eye on that shutter speed, because that's where the motion blur will start to creep in. So one more question before I'll show the night sky photos in just a moment. We're going to ask one more question. So Jim is asking, he's asking for 10 winter essentials. So maybe just share a couple of your favorite winter essentials with us, Aaron. So when you're out in the field, what are your go-to accessories that are not camera specific, but maybe hiking specific?
Sure. Yeah. So especially when I'm getting into fall, early spring, and definitely in winter, I'm always thinking about layers. So I will have base layers that are generally going to be wool. Wool's a great insulator, and even when it gets wet, it continues to keep you warm. So I'll usually wear top and bottom that are going to be base layers, either wool or synthetic. And then for pants, I'll try to wear something thicker, something that's got a little bit more insulation value. Socks are kind of the same way. I'll usually carry an extra pair of some more sturdy wool or heavier insulated socks. And then for upper, I'll usually wear a wool button-up shirt or a synthetic t-shirt, depending on what kind of temperatures I'm expecting. And then I'll have a compressible insulating layer, which I use synthetics, but downs might be more effective by weight. But I'm also really leery of anything that can get wet. I'm always trying to anticipate the worst possible scenario. if I get off trail and I end up being out there a lot longer than I thought, or if I get a jacket that soaks through, I want to make sure that I'm not going to get into an area where I'd have to worry about hypothermia. And then even in instances where we're going to have potentially snow, I still will carry a rain jacket, because in addition to keeping whatever is underneath that from getting wet and losing its insulation value or decreasing it, they're also really effective windbreakers. And by trying to think of how you can address those in layers instead of one thing, I find that it makes it really easy to adapt to whatever situations that may change as you're moving through a scene or through a trail. So you can, shed the insulating layer and just wear the shell to keep your body heating, but keep the environment and the temperature outside from affecting that too much. Or if you need everything, then you've got a couple options. You can layer up and hopefully keep warm longer.
Well,
gloves are super important too.
Yeah, I mean, in the Pacific Northwest, we know all about our layers, because
Yeah.
you could be on a trail or you could just be walking down the street, and you never know when the weather's going to shift on you. So we have a very long layer season here, as we all know. Does anyone have any wrap-up questions? I'm going to share those night sky shots that we did last year real quick. But does anybody else have any questions on landscape photography while I queue those up?
Yes, this is Arthur. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
You can.
Okay, I had just a quick question. I do a lot of shots, and I don't know if I came in a little late. Did you have any advice on what filters to put on your zoom when you're taking Mount Rainier to clear up the fog? Because I get a lot of foggy pictures when I try to shoot Mount Rainier.
So historically, a UV filter would have been probably the first recommendation. If you're shooting digitally, almost all digital cameras at this point have a UV filter over the sensor itself. So it's a lot less necessary to have a UV filter on the lens for that same reason. But those UV filters, whether they're in the camera or on the lens, are generally only effective at cutting like haze. It's not going to do anything if you're dealing with like an overcast or a cloudy day. There's not really anything you can do to cut that out. But I do find graduated neutral density filters are probably some of the most versatile filters for shooting landscape, because usually the issue that I have with exposure is that the sky is going to be at a way different value than whatever's on the foreground. So having a graduated neutral density filter, it's going to taper from its maximum density down to no density. And if you have a filter holder that mounts in the front of the lens, that allows you then to slide that in front and adjust the angle and adjust where that transition is happening, so that you can cut out some of the exposure in the sky without totally drowning out the exposure in the foreground.
Well, I would also interject that I would embrace that fog, but also keep an eye on the weather, because that fog will be there at different times of day. So, it could be foggy early in the morning, and then an hour or two later, that fog will probably clear. So maybe keep an eye on the weather in conjunction with all of that, so that you can get a little bit of a clearer shot. And that's also going to vary different times of year. So hopefully that's helpful.
That can be another instance where doing longer exposures might be an option too. If the cloud cover is moving in and out and it's not just solid socked in, if you do a longer exposure, you'll, rather than capturing that one moment where most of that scene is obscured by clouds, you'll capture the movement of the clouds through the scene. And that can add a really interesting texture and really affect the mood of the image.
Definitely. So I'm going to show these night sky photos. These are from an event that we did with Sigma. So Glazers and Sigma partnered up with Jack Fusco, who's a Sigma ambassador. And we went to Rainier National Park. Hopefully you can see these. Can you guys see this? So
right now it's just on Finder.
Okay. So can you see that? Maybe I need to share a different program. Hang on. Let's try this again. Share screen. Let's do preview. Let's see if that works better. Can you see that?
Yep.
So there's just a shot of Rainier. So Aaron and I did like a day hike. And then here's one of the night sky shots. So maybe this doesn't work. I should have opened a different program. Hang on.
We're all learning Zoom.
I know. Well, it didn't, anyhow. So there's one of the night sky shots. So can you guys see that? So this was shot on a Nikon camera with the Sigma, I believe it was the 14 2.8 lens.
Oh yeah, the 14-1.8.
Yeah, the 14-1.8, sorry.
Oh,
So, and that little red light you're seeing is actually someone's headlamp.
Yeah.
So anyhow, so that I'm gonna, I'll wrap this up here. I just wanted to share, somebody had asked to see one of the night sky photos. So there's one of the night sky photos. Thank you, Jim. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate Aaron and Sigma's time here. I'll just re-mention the fact that if you buy a Sigma lens between now and the end of June, 5% of the sales from those lenses are going to be donated by Sigma towards the Seattle Foundation's Responsive Fund for COVID-19. The store is open for curbside pickup Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, as well web sales 24/7, and we do offer free shipping for orders over 50 with some restrictions, unfortunately. So if you have questions, if you need gear or filters or tripods or whatever, we're here for you. Look for more of these sessions throughout April and into May as we continue to do our best to be engaged with all of you guys while we're all trying to shelter in place and stay safe. So thank you again so much for tuning in. Thank you, Aaron and Sigma, for being here. We really appreciate your time and energy. So we hope to see you next time. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.